He had turned away 11 women in a single morning, daughters of cattle barons, educated ladies from Boston, and one who arrived in a silk dress worth more than his entire south pasture. Coulter Hayes stood at the gate of the roughest ranch in Harlan County and said no to every single one of them while the whole territory watched and whispered. But it was what he did next that nobody ever forgot. At the far end of the wagon line, half hidden behind a broken trunk with a cracked leather strap, sat a young woman that everyone else had already decided didn't count. And Coulter Hayes walked straight toward her. Like this video, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Coulter Hayes rode into Delwood to choose a wife, half the county showed up to watch him fail. That was the honest truth of it, though nobody would have said so to his face. They came dressed in their Sunday clothes and stood along the main road with their arms crossed and their opinions already formed, the way people in small frontier towns always do when someone they half admire and half resent is about to make a spectacle of himself. Ranchers leaned against fence posts. Shopkeepers found reasons to sweep their front steps. Women who had never spoken a kind word about Coulter Hayes in their lives suddenly became deeply invested in his romantic future. He deserved it, in a way. He had been the one to place the advertisement. 3 lines in the Harlan County Gazette, blunt as a fence post. Rancher, 34, seeks a wife. Hard work guaranteed. Comfort is not. Courage preferred over everything else. That last line had caused a stir. Reverend Alcott had read it aloud at the general store and shaken his head slowly, the way he did when he disapproved of something but didn't want to say so directly. Adelaide Marsh, who ran the dry goods and knew everyone's business, had said that Coulter Hayes would regret putting that word in print. Courage. As if he were hiring a ranch hand rather than choosing a companion for life. But the advertisement had worked, in the sense that it brought women. 11 of them arrived on 2 wagons from the Eastern Territories, accompanied by a matron named Mrs. Elsa Pratt, who had organized the whole arrangement and who wore a permanent expression of professional optimism. They came from different places and different circumstances, but they had all read that advertisement and made their own calculations about what a successful frontier rancher might offer in return for a wife willing to work hard. Coulter was waiting at the gate when the wagons pulled up. He had not dressed up for the occasion. He wore his usual clothes, dark canvas trousers, a worn flannel shirt with a frayed cuff on the left side that he'd been meaning to mend for 2 months, and boots that had seen at least 4 hard winters. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his jaw carried 3 days of stubble because he had spent the previous 2 days in the north pasture dealing with a section of collapsed fencing and had come back too tired to bother with a razor. He looked, in short, like a man who had work to get back to. Mrs. Pratt climbed down from the first wagon with the careful dignity of a woman who took her professional reputation seriously and introduced herself with a firm handshake. Then she introduced the women, one by one, and Coulter Hayes watched each of them with the same quiet, evaluating attention he gave to everything on his ranch. Not unkind, but unimpressed by performance. The first woman was named Caroline Aldridge. She was the daughter of a cattleman from the Eastern Territories, pretty in a composed, deliberate way, with pale blue eyes and light brown hair pinned up with visible care. She smiled at Coulter the way someone smiles when they have practiced it. She told him her father ran 400 head and that she was comfortable with ranch life and had no objection to hard work, though her hands, Coulter noticed, were perfectly smooth. "Thank you," he said. "Not you." Caroline Aldridge blinked. The smile flickered. The second woman recovered from watching that exchange and stepped forward with extra confidence, as if deciding that boldness was the right strategy. Her name was Frances Whitmore. She came from a family with money and connections, and she told Coulter within the first 30 seconds that she could bring social standing and relationships with supply merchants that would benefit any frontier operation. "That's useful to someone," Coulter said. "Not to me. Thank you." The crowd watching from the road was already murmuring. By the 5th refusal, Mrs. Pratt had stopped looking optimistic and started looking like a woman trying to hold a difficult situation together through willpower alone. She had placed her hands together in front of her and was smiling with the fixed intensity of someone who has decided that if she stops smiling, everything will collapse. By the 8th refusal, the crowd along the road had started making bets. Coulter turned away a woman who had brought a letter of reference from a circuit judge. He turned away a woman who had learned to shoot a rifle specifically to improve her chances. He turned away a woman who burst into tears, real tears, not calculated ones, and he handed her his handkerchief and told her, gently but clearly, that she would find a better match than him somewhere else, and he meant it. By the time the 11th woman stepped forward, the mood along the road had shifted from entertainment to something closer to genuine contempt. It was one thing to be selective. It was another thing entirely to refuse 11 women in a single morning while half the territory watched. Several of the ranchers who had come to observe were now shaking their heads with the slow satisfaction of men who had privately doubted Coulter Hayes for years and felt they were finally being proven right. "He'll die on that ranch alone," said Vernon Galt, who ran a cattle operation 3 miles east and had never forgiven Coulter for outbidding him on a water rights claim 4 years ago. "Stubborn fool. Spent all that money on the advertisement, and now he's too particular to choose anyone." "Too particular, or doesn't actually want a wife at all," said someone else. The 11th woman's name was Helen Cross, and she was, by any conventional measure, the most impressive woman on either wagon. She was educated, articulate, clearly intelligent, and she presented herself with a calm dignity that even the hostile crowd along the road seemed to respect. She spoke to Coulter without flattery or calculation, just directly, and told him what she could offer and what she expected in return. He listened to her more carefully than he had listened to the others. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "I think you'd be good at this," he said. "I don't think you'd be good at my version of this. That's not an insult, it's just the truth." Helen Cross looked at him steadily. "I believe you," she said, and walked back to the wagon with her head up. That was when Mrs. Pratt folded her hands together and told Coulter Hayes with very careful politeness that she had no more candidates for him to consider, and she would appreciate knowing how he intended to proceed, because she had a schedule to keep and 2 wagons to return to Hedison by nightfall. Coulter said he understood, and he would not take up any more of her time. The crowd began to disperse. Several men were already mentally composing the version of this story they would tell at the saloon that evening, the one where Coulter Hayes humiliated himself in front of half the county by refusing 11 perfectly fine women because he was too proud and too strange to recognize what was good for him. It was a satisfying story. It had a clear moral. Nobody was looking at the second wagon anymore. That was where she was sitting. She was at the far end of the wagon bed, half turned away from the crowd, her attention focused on a leather trunk beside her with a broken strap that she was attempting to rebuckle with a length of cord she'd found somewhere. She was not watching the spectacle at the gate. She was dealing with a practical problem in front of her, quietly and without drama, and she had the focused expression of someone accustomed to solving small problems alone because no one was coming to help. Her name was Mara Quinn, and she had not been part of Mrs. Pratt's original arrangement. She had arrived in Delwood 3 days earlier on a supply wagon from Millhaven, carrying a letter from a woman named Agnes Foley, who had known Mrs. Pratt from previous work and had written on Mara's behalf. The letter described Mara as hardworking, capable, and honest. Mrs. Pratt had read it, looked at Mara, and decided without much deliberation that she would include her in the group simply because she had made the trip, and excluding her would have been unkind. But Mrs. Pratt had also decided, without saying so, that Mara Quinn was unlikely to be chosen by anyone. She was 23 years old and plain in the way that frontier life makes people plain. Not unattractive, exactly, but weathered beyond her years, with roughened hands, dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and clothes that had been mended and remended until the original color was hard to determine. She was not small and delicate. She was built like someone who had been carrying things since she was old enough to lift them. She had gray eyes that were direct and watchful, and didn't perform anything for anyone's benefit. She had grown up outside Millhaven in a 2-room homestead with a father who drank more than he farmed, and a mother who died when Mara was 11, leaving Mara to manage a household, a failing plot of land, and a parent she loved and couldn't save. By the time she was 18, she had taught herself to negotiate with supply merchants, manage a small vegetable operation that kept them fed through 2 bad winters, repair basic equipment, and treat minor injuries because the doctor was 12 miles away and they couldn't always afford him. When her father died of a fever 2 years ago, she had nothing. No land title, which had been in his name, no savings, and no family nearby who was able or willing to take her in. She had spent the following months doing domestic work in Millhaven, which she was capable of but which paid almost nothing, and she had answered Agnes Foley's suggestion about the Frontier Bride arrangement with the practical clarity of someone who has run out of better options and is not sentimental about it. She was not expecting to be chosen. She had watched the morning's proceedings from her place on the wagon without much reaction. And when Coulter Hayes turned away the 11th woman, she turned back to her trunk strap and kept working. She did not see him walk toward her. She became aware of him when his shadow fell across the wagon bed. She looked up. Coulter Hayes was standing at the wagon's side, looking at her with the same quiet, evaluating attention he had given every other woman that morning. He was not smiling. He was not performing anything. He was just looking at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand. "That trunk's lost its bracket," he said. "The cord's going to hold for a day, maybe two." Mara looked at the cord in her hand, then back at him. "I know," she said. "I'll get a proper repair when I find a smithy. There's one in Delwood, Rikers. He's honest and he doesn't overcharge." "Good to know," she said, and went back to tying the cord. There was a silence. Coulter stayed where he was. "You're not going to ask me anything?" he said. Mara glanced up at him. "I figured you'd ask if you wanted to know something." He looked at her for another moment. "What's your name?" "Mara Quinn." "Where are you from?" "Millhaven. Outside it, mostly. A homestead." "You farm?" "I tried to. Land went back to the county when my father died. No title in my name." "What have you been doing since then?" "Working?" She tied off the cord and tested it. "Domestic work, mostly. Whatever was available." "Why'd you come out here?" She looked at him directly. "Because I needed a better situation, and this was a concrete possibility." "That's an honest answer." "It's the true one." Coulter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you ride?" "Reasonably well." "Can you shoot?" "I haven't done it much. I can learn." "What are you actually good at?" Mara thought about it, not performing modesty or false confidence. "I'm good at figuring out what's wrong with something before it becomes a catastrophe. I'm good at making things last longer than they should. I'm good at not panicking when things go wrong, and things go wrong a lot." She paused. "I'm not decorative. I want to be honest about that." "I don't need decorative," Coulter said. "Then I expect we have something to talk about." He didn't smile exactly, but something shifted in his expression. He reached up and offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. She looked at it for half a second, just long enough for him to notice she was making a decision, not just reacting, and then she took it and climbed down. The moment Coulter Hayes walked back toward the gate with Mara Quinn beside him, the crowd that had been dispersing along the road stopped dispersing. Mrs. Pratt turned around. Her expression cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then a complicated mixture of professional satisfaction and personal doubt. The ranchers along the fence line stopped in their tracks. Vernon Galt stared. "Is he—" someone started. "He is," someone else confirmed. The reaction was not kind. The laughter started at the edges of the crowd and worked inward, quiet at first, and then not quiet at all. The sharp, mean laughter of people who feel they have just witnessed the punchline of a very long joke. Someone said something about the plainest woman getting the best ranch in Harlan County, and the people nearby thought that was very funny. Mara heard it. She had good ears, and the wind was in her direction, and she was not naive about what she was walking into. She kept walking. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened by a fraction that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed. Coulter heard it too. He stopped walking. He turned around slowly and looked at the crowd with the particular quality of stillness that very large, very calm men can deploy when they want to signal that they are not to be pushed further. The laughter died. "I'd appreciate it," he said in a conversational tone that didn't raise itself to be dramatic, "if you all went back to your own business." Nobody said anything else. He turned back to the gate and kept walking. The Hayes Ranch sat 6 miles north of Delwood on a high stretch of land that backed against the granite ridgeline of the Harlan Breaks, a series of rugged stone formations that made the northern boundary of the property essentially impassable to anyone who didn't know it well, and very useful to anyone who did. The land itself was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was severe, dry, and demanding, the kind of terrain that punished inattention and rewarded people who paid close attention to small details. The main house was built low and solid, 2 stories of timber and stone construction with a covered front porch and shuttered windows. Behind it stretched the working heart of the ranch: a large barn, 3 smaller outbuildings, a smithing shed, a root cellar, and a bunkhouse where the hands lived. The whole operation smelled of livestock, hay, leather, and wood smoke. It was not refined. It was functional. Coulter's ranch foreman was a man named Dutch Calloway, 52 years old, built like a fence post with muscle, taciturn to the point of near silence in ordinary circumstances, and in Coulter's opinion, one of the most reliable human beings alive. Dutch had been with Coulter since the beginning of the operation, which was 9 years ago now, and their relationship had moved past needing much verbal exchange to function. When Coulter arrived back from Delwood with Mara Quinn beside him on the wagon seat, Dutch was standing in the yard with a hammer in his hand and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. "Dutch," Coulter said, "this is Mara. She's going to be my wife." Dutch looked at Mara. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he is withholding a large number of thoughts. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Calloway," Mara said. Dutch went back to what he'd been doing. Mara watched him walk away and then said quietly to Coulter, "Is he always like that?" "That was warm," Coulter said. "Relatively speaking." The ranch hand's reaction was more visible, if not more welcoming. There were 4 of them: a young Texan named Eli Pryor, who was 20 years old and still optimistic about everything; 2 older hands named Brock and Hadley, who had worked frontier spreads their whole lives and assessed new situations with professional skepticism; and a half-Cheyenne man named River, who rarely spoke but observed everything with the quality of someone who had learned that watching carefully kept you alive. Eli Pryor greeted Mara with genuine friendliness, which was noted and appreciated. The others nodded and returned to work. River watched her from across the yard for a moment, and then he looked at Coulter with an expression that seemed, to Coulter's reading of it, cautiously approving. Coulter showed Mara the house. He gave her the larger of the 2 upstairs bedrooms and told her it was hers. He showed her the kitchen, which was functional and well supplied, the storage cellars, the water situation, and the layout of the working buildings. "I want to understand the operation," she said, standing in the barn doorway while he pointed out the feed situation and the current problem with the south pasture fencing. "Not just the house, the whole thing." "I'll show you." "Starting tomorrow?" "Starting now," he said. "If you want." She did. They married 4 days later at the county courthouse in Delwood, before a judge named Harlan Creech who had performed enough frontier marriages to have stopped investing them with much ceremony. There were no guests by choice. Mrs. Pratt had been informed, which satisfied the formal requirements. Dutch Calloway served as a witness, standing at the back of the small office with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in its usual expression of carefully contained opinion. It was not a romantic occasion. It was a legal contract entered into by 2 adults who had assessed the situation honestly and decided it was worth trying. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, Mara said, "I want to make one thing clear." "Go ahead," Coulter said. "I'm not going to pretend this is something it isn't. We're strangers who've made a practical decision, but I'm going to work as hard as any person on that ranch, and I'm going to earn my place there. I won't ask for anything I don't deserve." Coulter considered this. "That's what I'm hoping for." "Good." She climbed up to the wagon seat. "Then let's go back." He climbed up beside her. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, not talking much, which suited both of them. What followed was not what the territory expected. The general prediction, spoken openly by people like Vernon Galt and echoed by every woman who had been rejected that morning, was that the situation would collapse within a month. Coulter would realize his mistake. The plain, nobody bride would prove unequal to the ranch's demands. The story would end with a quiet, humiliating admission that the conventional wisdom had been right all along, and that choosing courage over charm was a beautiful idea with an ugly practical outcome. Mara Quinn set about dismantling that expectation one day at a time. She was up before the hands each morning, which was not a performance. She was constitutionally an early riser and had been since childhood, when the animals needed feeding before anyone else in the household was awake. She made herself useful in the kitchen first, not because that was her assigned role, but because it was an immediate, concrete need, and she was good at it. She could cook plain, substantial food efficiently and without waste, which earned her quiet points with ranch hands who had been eating Dutch's cooking, which was famously bad. But she did not stay in the kitchen. By the second week, she was out with the hands in the morning for the daily ride-out, learning the layout of the ranch's 500 acres with the systematic attention she had given to every practical problem in her life. She asked questions, not nervous, apologetic questions, but direct ones. What are the usual problem areas? Where does water collect badly after rain? Where do the cattle tend to drift when the weather turns? Dutch answered her in monosyllables at first, then in slightly longer phrases, which was his version of warming up. She noticed things. She noticed that the east water trough had a slow seep at its base that was wasting several gallons a day, and she mentioned it to Coulter with a specific suggestion about how to seal it. She noticed that the root cellar's ventilation was causing moisture damage to the stored vegetables on the east wall, and she rearranged the storage and cut 2 additional air holes that cost nothing but half an afternoon's work and saved a significant portion of the winter supply. She noticed that Eli Pryor's saddle was sitting wrong and causing his horse to move stiffly, which would eventually lame the animal if it went on long enough. "How'd you know that?" Eli asked, genuinely startled when she pointed it out. "The horse is overcompensating on his left front," she said. "Watch how he plants it. When a horse is carrying something uncomfortable, they shift weight. Means something's off in how the load is sitting." Eli stared at her. "You learned that in Mill Haven?" "I learned it from watching animals," she said. "You watch anything long enough, it starts talking to you." Eli thought about that. He adjusted the saddle. The horse moved normally the next morning. After that, Eli Pryor became something like an ally. Not because Mara cultivated it deliberately, but because he was 20 years old and impressed by competence wherever he found it, and he had an uncomplicated personality that didn't need to compete with the people around him. The other hands were slower. Brock and Hadley were professional skeptics about everything new, including her, but they were also professionals, which meant they couldn't ignore evidence. When Mara's read on the East Pasture drainage problem turned out to be correct, the flooding issue they'd been managing for 2 seasons proved to have the solution she'd suggested after one careful observation. Hadley's hostility softened into something neutral, which was as much as she had expected from him. River said nothing, as usual, but one morning, 3 weeks in, he left a pair of leather work gloves outside the kitchen door. They were the right size. She wore them and didn't mention it, which she understood was the correct response. Coulter watched all of this quietly. They had settled into a kind of careful domestic arrangement that was built more on mutual respect than warmth. They were honest with each other. They consulted each other on decisions that affected both of them. They sat at the same table in the evenings and spoke about the ranch with the comfortable, focused attention of 2 people who were genuinely interested in the same problem. Warmth was not yet the word for it, but it was building, slowly, the way anything real builds. Not in declarations, but in accumulated small moments. "You don't have to prove anything," Coulter said one evening, when she had come in late from the barn after dealing with a difficult calving situation that Brock had started, and she had finished. "I'm not proving anything," she said, washing her hands at the basin. "I'm doing what needs doing." "There's a difference?" She thought about it. "To me there is," she said. "Peut-être." The news of Coulter's choice had not stayed inside the ranch. In Delwood, the story had been told and retold until it had acquired the quality of local legend, slightly exaggerated, consistently unflattering to all involved. The version Vernon Galt told featured him as a voice of reason that no one had listened to. The version circulating among the women who had been rejected was more personal, more pointed, and contained a detailed inventory of Mara Quinn's perceived inadequacies, along with confident predictions of how it would all end. The rejected women had not gone home in embarrassment. Several of them had settled in the county or had family connections there, or had taken employment with other ranchers and homesteaders who had attended the morning spectacle with considerable interest. Among them was a woman named Charlotte Aldridge, the sister of Caroline, the first woman Coulter had refused, who had not been at the original selection but who had arrived in Delwood 2 weeks later and quickly became the social center of a small, determined group of women who had personal reasons to want Mara Quinn's marriage to fail. Charlotte was not cruel in a simple way. She was intelligent and strategic, and she understood how social pressure worked in a small frontier community. She didn't spread outright lies, but she spread doubts. She asked questions in the right places. She made observations at social gatherings that were phrased as concern. She cultivated relationships with the wives of ranchers who had already been skeptical of Coulter's choice, and she fed their skepticism with carefully chosen details. "I hear the ranch hands don't respect her," she would say, with the gentle regret of someone who wishes it weren't true. "I hear she's trying to manage the operation above her understanding," she would add at the next gathering. None of it was enough to do immediate damage, but it was enough to ensure that the territory's opinion of Mara Quinn stayed fixed in a particular position, dismissive, waiting for failure, and that any stumble Mara made would be seen and remembered and amplified by people who were already looking for it. Mara was not unaware of this. She had grown up in Millhaven, and Millhaven was a small community, and she understood perfectly well how social pressure operated and what it was trying to accomplish. "They want me to respond," she said to Coulter one evening, after a trip to town where she had felt the temperature of the public opinion firsthand. The measured coolness at the general store, the small cruelties of women who pretended not to see her, the way conversations shifted when she walked into a room. "They want to provoke a reaction they can talk about. And I'm not going to give them one." She looked at him. "Is that what you'd do?" "More or less," he said, "though my version would involve less patience. Your version would probably involve someone getting thrown through a fence." He didn't disagree. She had begun to understand him, in the way you understand people, when you live alongside them and pay attention. Coulter Hayes was not complicated, but he was layered in a way that took time to read. He was, at his foundation, a person who had been disappointed enough times by the distance between what things appeared to be and what they actually were that he had developed a nearly absolute preference for the real thing, even when it was harder, even when it was less comfortable, even when everyone around him thought he was making a mistake. He was not, she had determined, a man who made mistakes easily. He was a man who made deliberate decisions that looked like mistakes to people who were working from a different set of priorities. She respected that. She was not certain yet whether she liked him, which was a different question, but she respected him, which was where everything real started. 6 weeks into the marriage, the ranch had its first crisis. It came in the form of 7 dead cattle, found spread across the south pasture on a Tuesday morning. Not killed by weather or predator, but poisoned, apparently, by something in the water at the secondary trough in the southeast corner of the property. Dutch found them on the morning ride-out and came back to the house with the news wearing an expression that was, for Dutch, the equivalent of alarm. Coulter rode out immediately. Mara rode with him. The cattle were distributed across a 100-yard stretch of pasture, which was consistent with poisoning rather than disease. They had drunk from the trough and then scattered before the poison took effect. The trough itself was a secondary one, fed by a different source from the main water supply, used when the herd was in the south pasture rotation. Coulter crouched by the trough and looked at the water. It was visibly off, a slight discoloration at the surface edge that wasn't natural mineral residue. "Something was put in this," he said. Mara had already walked the perimeter of the trough. She was looking at the ground around the outer edge, where the soil was softer. "2 sets of boot prints," she said. "Both men. One heavier than the other, or one is carrying more weight. They came from the east." She followed the line of the prints with her eye. "Through the creek draw." "That's the property line," Coulter said. "Anyone coming from the east goes through Galt territory." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Could be coincidence," she said. "Could be," he said, in a tone that indicated he didn't believe it. "We need the stock counted and the rest of the water checked before we make any accusations," she said. "If there are other sources compromised, we need to know before anyone knows we're looking." Coulter looked at her. "You're right. And we should check the secondary barn supply line. If someone knew about this trough, they probably know the barn feed line. It's the other vulnerable point on the eastern side." He stood up. "How do you know that?" "I've walked the whole property," she said simply. "Twice. I wanted to understand it much." The barn feed line was clear. The contamination was limited to the secondary trough. 7 cattle lost. A serious financial blow, not a catastrophic one, but enough to hurt. The damage was real, and it had been deliberate. Coulter's first instinct was to ride to Galt's property directly and have a conversation that he would probably regret. Mara stopped him. "You go over there now. You've got nothing but boot prints that could have been anyone," she said. "He'll deny it. You'll end up in a confrontation with no evidence, and the county will say Coulter Hayes is picking fights with his neighbors again. He poisoned my cattle." "Probably," she said. "Maybe. We don't know. And even if we did, knowing and proving are two different things." She looked at him steadily. "Give me 2 weeks." "To do what?" "To watch," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. He was not a patient man by nature. He was a decisive man who solved problems by confronting them directly, and every instinct he had was pulling him toward the Galt property line and a direct reckoning. But he had chosen her because he thought she was capable of something. He might as well find out if he'd been right. 2 weeks, he said, boss. She didn't tell him everything she was doing in those 2 weeks because she hadn't worked it all out yet herself, and she didn't want to construct a theory before she had the pieces to build it properly. What she did was watch. She watched the patterns, who rode where, when, and from which direction. She noticed that in the 3 weeks before the cattle died, 2 different men had been seen at various points on the eastern property boundary, once by River, who mentioned it without making anything of it, once by Eli Pryor, who had assumed they were hunters, once by Mara herself, who had been checking the drainage situation along the creek draw and had seen 2 riders moving slowly along the ridgeline in a way that was not the way hunters moved. She talked to people in Delwood in the careful, unhurried way that women can talk to other women at the general store and the water pump, not interrogating, just listening, asking small questions, letting conversation move where it wanted to move. She talked to Adelaide Marsh at the dry goods, who knew everyone's business and could be trusted to report what she'd heard without exaggerating it, because Adelaide Marsh's professional pride was in her accuracy. She learned things. She learned that Vernon Galt had been having conversations with 2 other ranchers, men named Corbett and Plunkett, about the water rights situation on the North Creek, which fed both the Hayes Ranch and portions of 3 neighboring properties. She learned that there was a survey dispute that predated Coulter's operation, a question about where exactly the creek's primary source fell and who had legal claim to it, and that Galt had been quietly pushing for a formal resurvey for the past 6 months. She learned that if the Hayes Ranch failed financially, if it sustained enough damage to make Coulter unable to pay his land debt, the property would revert to a land bank that had connections to all 3 men. She brought this to Coulter on a Sunday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper on which she'd written out what she knew and how she knew it. He read it slowly. When he looked up, his expression was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not exactly anger, because she had seen his anger, and this was quieter and more controlled than that. It was the expression of a man who has been handed a precise confirmation of something he already suspected, and who is now working out what to do with it. "Galt," he said. "Galt and the others. Galt is the primary. The others are following his lead, I think." "You think." "I know the motive. I know the opportunity, the direct connection between the poisoning and their involvement. I don't have that yet. But you'll get it. Give me more time." He pushed the paper back across the table to her. "Keep going," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was something better. It was a man saying, without sentiment, that he trusted her. Okay. The weeks that followed developed their own complicated rhythm. The ranch work continued. It always continued, because livestock and land didn't pause for human problems. Mara worked her usual hours and maintained the external appearance of a woman fully occupied with ordinary ranch concerns, which was mostly true. The investigation, if she would have called it that, happened in the margins. Early mornings, evenings in Delwood, conversations that didn't announce themselves as significant. And while she watched, the sabotage continued. A section of the north fencing was cut, done cleanly, with wire cutters, letting 30 head drift into the adjacent terrain, where it took 2 days and significant labor to recover them. A supply wagon bringing winter goods from Delwood was delayed after one of its wheels was found to have been tampered with, and the goods arrived late and partially damaged by weather exposure. Small things, individually, accumulating. What she noticed, and this was the observation that began to pull the picture into focus, was the timing. The incidents happened when Coulter was in town, or when a significant portion of the hands were away from the core of the ranch. They happened in a pattern that required someone to know the ranch's schedule. Someone was reporting to Galt. She spent a week on this, and at the end of it she knew who it was. His name was Clem Doyle, and he was not a ranch hand. He was a delivery man who had been bringing supplies to the Hayes Ranch from Delwood twice a month for the past year. He was friendly, unremarkable, the kind of man who's easy to overlook. He had perfect visibility into the ranch's schedule and inventory. He was in debt to Vernon Galt, who held a note on his delivery operation. She didn't tell Coulter about Doyle. Not yet. Not until she could complete the picture. But she was close. The evening before everything changed, Coulter found her at the kitchen table after midnight. She had the lamp burning low and a piece of paper in front of her, covered in her careful, economic handwriting. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Not yet." He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, which she had apparently made recently enough that it was still warm, and sat down across from her. "How close?" he said. She looked at him. "Soon." He nodded. He looked at the paper for a moment, though he couldn't read it from where he sat. Then he said unexpectedly, "Why'd you really come out here? To Delwood?" She was quiet for a second. "I told you I needed a better situation." That's the practical answer. It's the real one. "I know," he said. "I'm asking if there's more to it." She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything, without performing an answer, just looking at it. "I needed to not be the person that Millhaven had decided I was," she said finally. "When you've lived in a small place long enough, people build a picture of you and stop looking at the actual thing. I wanted somewhere I could start without that." Coulter was quiet. "That's something I understand," he said. They sat in the low lamplight for a little while, not saying anything else, which was, she had learned, one of the things about him she genuinely valued. He could be silent without it being uncomfortable, because he wasn't filling the silence with anxiety, just occupying it. She looked at her paper and thought about Vernon Galt and Clem Doyle and the men who were betting that the wrong bride would bring Coulter Hayes down. She was going to prove them wrong. She was 3 days away from it. 3 days. 3 days turned into 2, and then into 1, and then the morning Mara had been building toward arrived. And everything went sideways before she was ready. It started with Eli. He came into the kitchen before dawn with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Mara had learned to read as bad news delivered by someone who wasn't sure how to deliver it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she set down her coffee cup and waited. "Doyle came early," he said. "Supply drop. He was out by the east barn for longer than he needed to be." Mara went still. "How long?" 20 minutes. I only noticed because I came back for a second pair of gloves. He didn't see me." "Did he go near the water line?" Eli hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. I didn't want to get closer and spook him." She was already moving past him toward the door. The east barn water line fed the primary livestock supply for the winter holding pens. The most critical water source on the property, the one that if compromised would do real damage, not just the nuisance-level losses they'd absorbed so far. She got there in 4 minutes at a hard walk and checked every junction point along the line's visible run. At the third connection, where the pipe ran under the barn's eastern foundation, she found it, a small cloth bundle wedged into the junction housing, damp and starting to dissolve, whatever it contained already beginning to seep into the line's slower-moving sections. She pulled it out with her bare hands, which she would regret later, and held it away from herself while she examined it. Some kind of mineral salt mixture, concentrated, enough to sicken the herd held in those pens if it had been left another few hours. She went back to the house. Coulter was in the yard by then, and one look at her face told him something had happened. She held up the bundle. "Doyle," she said. "This morning, east barn line." His jaw tightened in a way that meant he was containing something significant. "You have enough now." Yes. Then we're done waiting. She had known he would say that, and she didn't argue. She had collected what she needed. She had the timing pattern, the connection between Doyle and Galt, the financial motive linking Galt to Corbett and Plunkett, and now a direct act of sabotage she could put in Doyle's hands with a witness. It wasn't a courtroom case, not yet, but it was enough to move. "Let me go to Delwood first," she said. "I'm coming with you." "I know." She looked at him. "But you let me talk when we get there." He didn't like it. She could see that plainly. Coulter Hayes was a man who solved his problems by standing directly in front of them and not moving, and being asked to let someone else lead in a moment that felt to him like a confrontation was genuinely difficult. But he nodded once because he had told himself 2 weeks ago that he was going to trust her, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. They rode into Delwood before 8 in the morning. Clem Doyle's delivery operation ran out of a small warehouse on the south side of town, 3 buildings down from the feed merchant. He was there when they arrived, unhitching his horses from the morning run, and he saw them coming from 30 yards out, and the color left his face in a way that told Mara everything she needed to confirm about his guilt. He tried to be casual about it. "Mr. Hayes." "Morning." Coulter said nothing. He stopped his horse and waited. Mara dismounted and walked toward Doyle at an even pace, without hurry, and stopped close enough that he couldn't pretend the conversation was general. "You left something behind at the East Barn this morning," she said. "I found it." Doyle opened his mouth, closed it. "I want to be clear about what's going to happen," Mara continued. "You're going to tell me exactly what Galt asked you to do, when he asked you to do it, and how much he's paying you. You're going to tell me that in front of witnesses, and then we're going to decide how much trouble you're in." "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had the quality of a man reciting a line he'd prepared rather than a man who actually didn't know. "Eli Pryor saw you at that junction for 20 minutes this morning," she said. "Eli is 17 miles from here right now and will say exactly that to anyone who asks." This was not entirely true. Eli was still at the ranch, but it was close enough to the truth that the distinction didn't matter much. "The bundle I pulled out of that junction had your boot prints in the mud beside it. You have a note outstanding with Vernon Galt for $600. I know all of this." Doyle stared at her. Then he looked at Coulter as if hoping Coulter would do something that would change the shape of the conversation. Coulter looked back at him with an expression that offered nothing. The silence held for about 10 seconds, and then Doyle's shoulders dropped about an inch, which was the physical vocabulary of a man who has run out of a particular kind of energy. "I needed the debt cleared," he said, his voice dropping. "That's all." He said it wouldn't hurt anyone, just slow things down. "Killed 7 of my cattle," Coulter said. His voice was quiet and even, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. Doyle said nothing. "The South Trough," Mara said. 6 weeks ago. That was you." He nodded, barely. "And the fencing on the north line." Another nod. "Did Corbett or Plunkett know what Galt was doing?" Doyle looked up. This question clearly surprised him, that she knew those names. He thought about it for a moment. Corbett knew. Plunkett? I think he knew something was happening, but he didn't ask questions. Mara looked at Coulter. He looked back at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, a compressed, controlled version of something larger, held in check by a determination to handle this correctly rather than satisfyingly. "We're going to see the county sheriff," Mara said to Doyle. "You're going to come with us and tell him what you told me." Galt has a great deal more to worry about than you do right now," she said. "You cooperate, and the damage to my husband's property doesn't land entirely on your head. You don't cooperate, and it does." It was not a kind set of choices. She wasn't trying to be kind. She was trying to close a situation that had been bleeding damage into the ranch for 2 months, and kindness was not the right tool for it. Doyle went with them. The county sheriff was a man named Aldous Cray, a deliberate, careful lawman who had held the office for 11 years and who had managed to stay trustworthy in a county where trustworthy was a complicated thing to be. He listened to Doyle's account with the patient, unimpressed attention of a man who has heard a great many confessions and knows how to separate the parts that matter from the parts that are self-serving. When Doyle finished, Cray looked at Mara. "You pulled this yourself." He was referring to the bundle, which she'd brought with her in a cloth sack. "This morning, before 6. You didn't think to leave it in place and send for me? I thought it was more important to prevent the contamination from reaching the livestock. Cray looked at the bundle, then at Coulter, then back at Mara with the expression of a man revising a prior assessment. He had met Mara Quinn twice before, in town, and had formed the opinion that she was quiet and hardworking and probably out of her depth in this marriage. He was updating that opinion in real time, which he did with professional thoroughness. I'll ride out to Galt's property today, he said. Corbett, too. What about Plunkett? Coulter said. I'll talk to Plunkett. Cray paused. I'd ask you not to do anything before I've had that conversation. He was looking at Coulter when he said it, not Mara. He'll wait, Mara said. Coulter looked at her sideways. I'll wait, he confirmed, in the dry tone of a man who is acknowledging that someone just answered for him and has decided not to make it an issue. Cray nodded and stood up, which was his way of concluding a meeting. They rode back toward the ranch in the mid-morning light. The day had gone warm, the kind of pale, clear warmth that Harlan County got in the weeks before winter shut everything down, and the road north was empty except for a hawk riding the thermals above the creek draw. You told him I'd wait, Coulter said. You were going to say you'd wait anyway. I might have said it differently. With more room for interpretation, she said. A pause. Maybe. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, jaw set, but there was something in his expression that wasn't irritation. It was more like a man working through the experience of being known accurately by someone, which was comfortable and uncomfortable in equal measure. Galt is going to hear about Doyle before Cray gets to him, she said. He'll have time to prepare something. I know. Which means this isn't finished by a long way. I know that too. He turned to look at her. You knew that when you decided to go to Cray instead of handling it another way. Going around the law would give Galt more to use against us, she said. He wants this to look like a feud between ranchers. If we do anything outside the law, that's what it becomes. Coulter was quiet for a long moment. You think about several moves ahead. I try to. It's not a common quality. Neither is patience, she said, for either of us. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening exactly, because Coulter Hayes did not soften in easy or obvious ways, but settling, the way a thing settles when it finds its correct position. He turned back to the road. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. The ranch hands read the morning's outcome in the way ranch hands read everything, through the body language of the people returning and the quality of the silence around them. Dutch met them in the yard and received a brief summary from Coulter. 5 sentences, no more, and responded with a single slow nod that indicated he understood, had processed the situation, and would adjust accordingly. Eli, who had spent the morning doing his work with the focused energy of someone burning off anxiety, looked at Mara with a direct question in his expression, and she told him what had happened with the same brevity Coulter had used with Dutch. So Doyle's in with Cray now? Eli asked. For now. And Galt? Waiting on Cray to make his visit. Eli's young face went through several expressions, landing on one that was trying to be more optimistic than it fully managed. That's good, right? That's the law working on our side. It's the law doing its job, Mara said, which is what we wanted. She didn't add what she was thinking, which was that Galt was smart enough to have layered protections around himself, and that Cray's visit would likely produce denials and a shifting of blame to Doyle alone, and that the road between where they were now and any actual accountability for Vernon Galt was going to be longer and harder than the morning's progress suggested. She was right about that. Cray's visit to Galt produced exactly the conversation she had predicted. Civil, careful, Galt expressing his shock and regret about Doyle's behavior, expressing his firm intention to cooperate with any investigation, and expressing, very gently, his doubts about Doyle's credibility as a witness, given the man's existing financial difficulties and his well-documented tendency to shift blame. Cray reported this to Coulter the following week with the professional neutrality of a man doing his job in difficult circumstances. He's not wrong that Doyle's a compromised witness, Cray said. A defense lawyer would eat him alive. We need something more direct. Which we don't have, Coulter said. Which you don't have yet, Cray agreed, and left the yet hanging there in the way that a careful lawman leaves useful words hanging. The sabotage stopped after Doyle's cooperation became known. Whoever was coordinating it was too cautious to continue with that particular avenue exposed. But the damage shifted into a different form, less physical and more social, which in some ways was harder to fight. The rumors Charlotte Aldridge had been cultivating for weeks broke into open circulation. The story that spread through Delwood in the fortnight following Doyle's exposure was a masterwork of deliberate distortion. It acknowledged the poisoning and the sabotage, which were impossible to deny, but reframed them as the inevitable consequence of Coulter's poor judgment in bringing an unknown, unvetted woman into a position of influence over a significant property. If he'd chosen correctly in the first place, the narrative went, none of this trouble would have started. The sabotage existed because the ranch had become a target. The ranch had become a target because it was vulnerable. It was vulnerable because Coulter had made it so. Mara heard the shape of this story from Adelaide Marsh at the dry goods, who told her with the careful precision of a woman who wanted her to know what she was facing without editorializing too much. Charlotte Aldridge has been talking to Reverend Alcott, Adelaide said, and Alcott talks to everyone. What is she saying to him? That a man of Coulter's standing deserved better support, that the community failed him by not speaking up sooner. Adelaide's expression was the careful neutral of someone trying to be fair. She's not saying your name, mostly. She doesn't need to. Mara thanked her and went back to the wagon. She sat in the wagon seat for a few minutes in the thin autumn sunlight before she picked up the reins. Not because she needed to compose herself. She was past composing herself about Charlotte Aldridge, but because she was thinking carefully about what the right response was. The wrong response was to ignore it. Silence in the face of a sustained social campaign reads as confirmation. She knew that from Millhaven, where she had made the mistake of silence once before and had watched the picture people built of her calcify into something she couldn't shift. The right response was not a confrontation either. Confronting Charlotte directly would give her exactly the dramatic incident she was angling for. The scorned plain bride lashing out at the polished woman who had been rejected in her place. It would confirm every narrative Charlotte was constructing. What she needed was something different. She drove back to the ranch and spent the evening thinking, and by the time she went to bed, she had the shape of it worked out. It was not complicated. It was just patient. Over the following 2 weeks, Mara made herself visible in Delwood in a very specific way. She went to town for ordinary reasons. Supply runs, a visit to the smithy, a conversation with the feed merchant about winter prices. But she did not hurry through these errands. She talked to people. Not about Galt or Doyle or the sabotage or Charlotte Aldridge. She talked about practical things. The coming winter, how the cold was sitting different this year, what the ranchers in the eastern part of the county were doing about the grass shortage in the lower pastures. She talked about what she knew, which was land and livestock and weather and practical management, and she talked about it plainly, without performing expertise, just sharing information the way people share information when they genuinely know something useful. And because she knew what she was talking about, people listened. Not everyone, but enough. The feed merchant told her about a technique he'd heard for preserving root vegetables through a harder freeze, and she told him she'd tried a version of it and explained what worked and what hadn't. And 3 other men in the store at the time listened to that conversation and remembered it. A woman named Pearl Briggs, whose husband ran a modest homestead south of Delwood, asked Mara about the drainage problem the Briggs property had been dealing with for 2 seasons. And Mara answered her with the same focused attention she'd given to her own ranch's drainage, asking questions about the land's slope and the soil composition and the seasonal water patterns before she said anything definitive. "Come out and look at it," Pearl said. "Seriously, my husband would rather lose the pasture than admit he can't solve it himself, but we can't afford another season of that flooding." Mara went. She spent an afternoon at the Briggs property and identified the problem. A collapsed subsurface channel that was redirecting water in the wrong direction, and suggested a specific, inexpensive solution that her father had used once in Millhaven on similar terrain. She didn't know for certain that it would work, and she said so. But the Briggses tried it, and it worked, and Pearl Briggs mentioned it to other women, the way women in frontier communities mention things that matter. None of this was a campaign, exactly. It was just a person being useful, deliberately and consistently, in a place that needed useful people. But it had an accumulating effect, quiet and gradual, that ran counter to the picture Charlotte Aldridge had been painting. Coulter watched it. He didn't say much about it. He was not a man who narrated his observations, but one evening he came in from the barn to find Mara at the kitchen table, reviewing the ranch's supply accounts, which she had taken over managing 2 weeks ago with his agreement, and he poured himself coffee and said, "Pearl Briggs's husband came by today." Mara looked up. "He wanted to know if you'd look at their north fence line," Coulter said. "Said he'd pay for your time." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "Told him you'd decide." He looked at her over his cup. "You should go. It's worth having the Briggses think well of us." "I know," she said, "but that's not why I'd go." He studied her for a second. "No," he said. "I know it's not." There were moments like this between them, increasingly, that were not dramatic but that had weight. Small exchanges in which something accurate passed between two people who were still learning each other's actual shape, as opposed to the shape they'd assumed they were getting. She went to the Briggs property the following Thursday. She spent 2 hours on their north fence line and came back with mud on her boots and a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone watching. The county's opinion of her had not transformed. It was not that simple, and she had not expected it to be. But the solid wall of dismissal had developed cracks. Small ones, let in by practical evidence that ran counter to the story people had accepted about the plain bride who had stumbled into a situation above her. Some people had revised. Others hadn't and wouldn't. She was not trying to win everyone. She was trying to build something real enough to stand on, and she was doing it the only way she knew how, one concrete thing at a time, in full view of anyone who cared to look. What she did not know yet was that Vernon Galt had been watching her patient construction with a great deal of attention, and that he had drawn a conclusion from it that made him more dangerous rather than less. He had concluded that waiting was no longer working in his favor. Galt's conclusion arrived at the Hayes Ranch on a Thursday night in the form of 8 armed men. Mara heard them before she saw them. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when something pulled her out of it. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of the usual sounds, the way the horses in the near paddock went quiet all at once, in a way that meant they had registered something the humans hadn't caught yet. She was out of bed and at the window in the time it took her heart to find its rhythm, and through the glass she could see shapes moving in the dark beyond the yard's edge. She crossed the hall and knocked twice on Coulter's door. Their arrangement was still separate rooms, which was practical and unspoken and suited both of them, and said his name once, quietly. He opened the door already half-dressed, which meant he slept lightly or had heard something too. She pointed toward the south window without speaking. He looked. "How many?" he said, his voice barely above a murmur. 8. Maybe more past the tree line. I only have the ones I can see. He moved to his rifle before she finished the sentence. She went back to her room for the shotgun he had given her 3 weeks ago when she'd asked to learn to shoot properly, and he had spent 4 evenings teaching her with the straightforward patience he applied to any practical problem. She had not become skilled with it. She was accurate enough at close range, which was the only range that would matter inside a building. She came back to the hallway. He was already moving toward the stairs. "I need to get to the bunkhouse," he said. "Dutch and the hands need to know. The men coming from the south will see you cross the yard." "I know." "There's the root cellar passage," she said. "It connects to the storage room behind the bunkhouse. I found it when I was checking the foundation seep last month. I don't know if you knew about it." He stopped. "I didn't. 12 feet underground, cuts under the yard. It's low. You'll have to bend, but they won't see you." He looked at her in the dark hallway for a half-second with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he said, "Show me." She took him down to the kitchen, to the floor panel beside the root cellar stairs that she'd found by accident and had not mentioned yet because there had not seemed to be a reason to. She pulled it up. The passage below smelled of cold earth and old timber. "Light?" he said. "There's a lamp bracket about 6 feet in. I left matches there." He looked at her again. "You left matches?" "I like knowing where things are," she said. He took the passage. She closed the panel behind him and went to the kitchen window to watch the yard. The men outside were not moving quickly, which told her something. They were positioned rather than advancing, spread in a loose arc across the south and west faces of the property. That was a containment formation rather than a direct assault. They were trying to close off exits before they moved. which meant either they were professional enough to do this systematically or someone had given them a plan. She thought about the layout of the ranch the way she had been thinking about it for months, the way she thought about every piece of land she lived on, its vulnerabilities and its strengths, the places where it protected you and the places where it didn't. The south and west were the open approaches. The north backed against the Harlan Breaks, the granite ridgeline that made that boundary essentially impassable to anyone who didn't know the specific paths through. The east had the creek draw and the tree cover. She thought about the narrow cattle trail that ran along the base of the breaks, used twice a month to rotate stock through the upper pasture. She thought about where that trail came out on the county road, 3 miles north and west of Galt's property line. She thought about what Galt was actually trying to accomplish tonight. Not just damage, he'd tried damage and it hadn't been enough. He wanted the ranch, which meant he needed Coulter unable to hold it, financially or physically, and a destruction event, the house, the barn, the main livestock, would accomplish the financial piece. If Coulter was also injured in the process, so much the better. It would be reported as a raid by unknown men, the kind of thing that happened on the frontier, tragic and impossible to investigate thoroughly. The bunkhouse door opened and Coulter came out with Dutch behind him, and then Eli, and then Brock and Hadley, and River last, all of them moving in the practiced quiet of men who have worked together long enough to communicate without talking. They came to the back of the main house through the kitchen entrance, which was in the blind spot created by the barn's eastern wall. 6 of them in the kitchen. The lamp was out. Coulter relayed positions in a low voice, and Dutch listened with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. 8 confirmed, Coulter said. Possibly more in the tree line. Armed? Dutch said. Rifles, at least some of them. Dutch looked at Mara, which surprised her. She had not expected to be included in whatever tactical consultation was happening. You saw the positioning, Dutch said. It was not quite a question. South and west, containment arc, she said. They're not set up for the north approach. The breaks are behind them. They think the breaks are impassable, Coulter said. Most people do, she said. Coulter looked at her. You've been up the trail. Several times, the cattle rotation. She paused. And on my own. I wanted to know where it went. Dutch and Coulter exchanged a look that contained a complete conversation. If we go north through the breaks, Coulter said, we come out on the county road above them, which puts us behind whatever position they think is a clean escape route, she said. If things go badly here, their plan is to pull out north and west. That's the logical retreat, away from Delwood, toward Galt's territory. If we're already on that road, Dutch said slowly, then their retreat becomes a different situation. Brock spoke up from the corner of the kitchen, his voice carrying the skepticism of a man who has seen plans go wrong in high-pressure moments. There are 6 of us. There are at least 8 of them. That's not favorable math regardless of which direction we're coming from. 7, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. 7 of us, she said. I'm not staying in the house. Coulter said, You're not... I know the trail through the breaks better than anyone in this room, she said, flatly and without drama. I've walked it in daylight and in low light. In the dark, you need someone who knows where the drop-offs are, because there are 3 of them, and 2 are not obvious. You need me. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. She's right about the trail, River said. It was one of the longer statements she had heard him make. Everyone in the room seemed to register this, because when River offered an opinion, it landed with particular weight. Coulter's expression was a man running 2 calculations at the same time. The practical one, which said she was correct about the trail and her knowledge was genuinely useful, and the other one, which was the reaction of a person who has started, without fully meaning to care what happens to someone, and who finds that caring inconveniently in conflict with the immediate situation. He looked at her for a long moment. You stay close to me, he said. Agreed. Not behind me, beside me, so I know where you are. Agreed. Dutch had already moved to the window and was doing a slow, professional assessment of the positions outside. They'll move soon, he said. They're waiting on something. A signal, maybe, or a time. But they've been set for 20 minutes, and men get impatient. Then we go now, Coulter said. They went out through the root cellar passage, one by one, Mara third and Coulter last. Under the yard, in the cold-smelling dark, she counted 12 steps to the bracket where the matches were and lit the lamp to its lowest setting, enough to move by without being a beacon. The passage ran 40 feet to the storage room, and they came up through the storage room floor into the dark behind the bunkhouse, which was outside the arc of the men in the yard. From there it was a 100-yard run to the base of the breaks, through the paddock and the scatter of boulders at the granite's foot. If any of the men stationed along the south perimeter had good eyesight and the right angle, they might catch movement. But the night was moonless, and the paddock fence threw enough shadow to break up a moving silhouette if you stayed low. They made it. The trail up through the breaks was exactly as difficult in the dark as Mara had expected, which was why she had said what she said in the kitchen. The path was narrow and uneven, winding between granite formations that looked, in darkness, like indistinguishable variations of the same gray-black mass. She had walked it enough times that she had the landmarks in her body rather than her head. The flat boulder that meant the first turn, the sound of the small water seep that meant the second, the change in the texture of the ground underfoot that came just before the first real drop-off, which was a 6-foot fall into a rock channel that would put a man out of the fight for the rest of the night if he stepped wrong. She stopped the group at that point, 3 feet before the edge, and redirected them left along the granite face to the traversal point she'd found on her third trip up, a narrow ledge that was wide enough for one person moving carefully. Hadley went across and said nothing, which was Hadley's version of impressed. They came out on the county road in 40 minutes. The road was empty and dark. To their south, a quarter mile, they could see the faint orange suggestion of lamplight from the direction of the ranch, which meant the men in the yard had either moved or lit something. "They've started," Dutch said. Coulter's hand tightened on his rifle. Mara put her hand briefly on his forearm, not restraining, just present, and he exhaled once and held position. "Give them 3 more minutes," she said. "If they're burning, there's nothing we can recover by rushing. If they're still setting up, 3 minutes puts us in a better position." 3 minutes, he said through his teeth. It was not agreement exactly, but he held. She used those 3 minutes to look at the road and the terrain on either side with the same systematic attention she gave to everything. The county road here was flanked on the west by a dry creek bed, depressed maybe 4 feet below the road grade, running north-south in a line that would serve, in the dark, as effective cover for anyone moving along it. On the east, a scatter of scrub pine and granite outcrops provided irregular cover but required careful footing. She explained this to Coulter in a low voice, and he passed it to Dutch, and Dutch arranged the 6 of them without her having to specify further, because Dutch was a man who understood terrain. The 3 minutes ended. The sound of horses reached them from the south. Not a large group moving fast, but a measured retreat, the way men move when they think they've done what they came to do and are pulling back on schedule. 4 horses, maybe 5, moving north on the county road, coming directly toward them. River had positioned himself flat in the dry creek bed 20 yards south with a clear line of sight down the road. He made no sound and no movement, which he was extraordinarily good at. Coulter and Dutch were in the scrub pine on the east side. Eli was behind the largest granite outcrop with the specific instruction to stay behind it no matter what happened, which he accepted with the seriousness of a young man who has just understood that instructions like that are given for real reasons. Mara was in the creek bed north of River's position, which put her behind the approaching riders after they passed. This had been her own suggestion, and Coulter had not liked it, but she had explained the geometry quietly, and he had conceded it because she was right. She was also, she would have been honest about this later, more frightened than she had expected to be. It was a physical thing. Her hands were not quite steady, and the cold night air seemed sharper than it had been. She had dealt with difficult and dangerous situations before. She had not dealt with this particular kind before, which was the kind where armed men were coming toward you in the dark, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. She controlled it the way she controlled most things, by focusing on what was immediate and concrete and within her influence, and letting everything else sit in her peripheral vision where it couldn't crowd out her thinking. The horses came level with River's position. He let 2 of them pass. Then he stood up in the creek bed behind them, not firing, just visible, and said in a carrying voice, "Stop where you are." They didn't stop. The lead rider pulled his horse hard, and the animal shied sideways into the road. And from the pine scrub on the east, Coulter's voice came, clear and flat. I said, "Stop." The combination of voices from two directions did what one voice hadn't. It put the riders in the calculation that they were surrounded, which they approximately were. 3 of them reined in. One pushed his horse forward, north, running for it, and came around the bend in the road directly into the spot where Mara was standing in the creek bed with the shotgun leveled at his horse's chest. She had no intention of shooting the horse. She said so clearly. "Pull up or I fire." The rider pulled up. His horse danced sideways, and he controlled it with the automatic competence of a man who has ridden a long time, and he looked down at her with an expression that went through surprise and contempt and settled somewhere in between when he registered that she was entirely steady and entirely serious. "Get down," she said. He got down. The 4 remaining riders, faced with voices from 3 directions and one of their number already dismounted, made the calculation that men make when a plan has gone wrong in ways they weren't prepared for. The calculation took about 30 seconds, and at the end of it, they put their rifles down. The man Mara had stopped was the one she had expected, not one of the unknown hired hands, but a man she had seen twice before, once at Vernon Galt's property line, and once outside the feed merchant in Delwood, always slightly apart from whatever group he was with, always watching rather than participating. His name, she would learn in the next hour, was Fen Craddock, and he had been working for Galt for 3 years in a capacity that Galt would have described as ranch security, and a more honest assessment would have described differently. He looked at her in the dark road with an expression that had settled into a wary neutrality. "Who are you?" he said, though his tone suggested he already had a general idea. "Mara Hayes," she said. "This is my ranch you just tried to burn." The barn's south wall had caught. They found this when they got back, Eli running ahead and coming back with the news that had Coulter moving fast before Eli finished the sentence. But Dutch had left a water line running in the barn as a precaution before they'd gone through the passage, a detail Dutch had attended to without being asked, because Dutch was the kind of man who thought about water lines, and the fire had not progressed past the south wall's exterior boards. An hour's work, all hands, and a great deal of water from the main supply got it contained. The barn stood. The livestock in the main holding pens were unharmed. The house was untouched. The damage was the south wall, which was significant but repairable, and the loss of a supply shed that had been closer to where the men had lit their initial fire and had not been salvageable. At some point in the controlled chaos of the fire suppression, Dutch came to stand beside Mara, who was working the water line at the barn's east junction. He stood there for a moment without speaking, which, with Dutch, covered a wide range of possible communications. "The passage under the yard," he said finally. "You found that yourself." "A few weeks ago." He was quiet again. "You've been walking the property," he said. Understanding it seemed important. Dutch nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something that required adjustment. "It is important," he said. And then he went back to work. It was not by any reasonable measure a compliment, but from Dutch Calloway at 2 a.m. after a firefight, it was something she tucked away. Craddock and the 4 riders were tied and sitting in the yard when Sheriff Cray arrived at dawn, summoned by Eli, who had ridden to Delwood as soon as the fire was contained. Cray looked at the 5 men, at the damaged barn wall, at Coulter standing in the yard with smoke on his clothes and a particular quality of exhaustion that is specific to people who have been fighting in the dark, and then at Mara beside him. "You want to tell me what happened?" Cray said. Coulter started to answer. Mara said quietly, "I'll explain it." And she did. Not everything. Not the parts that needed more time to be useful, but the shape of the night, clearly and in the correct sequence, the kind of account that a careful lawman can work with. Cray listened with his hat in his hands and his expression closed and professional. When she finished, he looked at Craddock. Craddock said nothing. "He works for Vernon Galt," Mara said. "Has for 3 years." Cray looked at Craddock for another moment. "That right?" Craddock looked at the ground. Cray put his hat back on. "I'm going to need you both to come to Delwood," he said to Coulter. "This afternoon. Bring whatever you've got on Galt." "All of it?" Mara said. Cray looked at her. "Everything." She nodded. "Everything, then." Coulter found her an hour later at the well, washing the smoke off her hands and face, and he stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. "The drop-off," he said finally. "The 6-foot one. You stopped us 3 feet back. 2.5, probably." "I didn't feel it. I wouldn't have known it was there." She wrung the water from her hands and didn't say anything. "I want to say something," he said, and then he paused in the way he paused when he was choosing his words with actual care rather than just producing whatever came first. "I know what you did tonight, all of it, the passage, the trail, the road. I know what that cost you, the standing there in the dark with that gun." She looked at him. "I'm not going to say you shouldn't have done it," he said. "That would be dishonest. You did exactly what needed doing." "I was frightened," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know you were." "I did it anyway." "I know," he said. "That's the part that matters." They stood at the well in the early morning light with the smell of smoke still on everything, and it was not a romantic moment by any definition. They were both exhausted and dirty, and the yard behind them was still a mess of boot prints and scattered equipment and the charred evidence of the previous night's violence. But something had shifted between them in the way things shift between people who have stood in the dark together and come out the other side. And both of them felt it without needing to name it yet. Coulter reached over and took her hand briefly and squeezed it once, the gesture of a man who is not fluent in tenderness but is making an honest attempt at it. She squeezed back. Then they both went back to work because the barn wall wasn't going to repair itself, and there was a great deal still to do before the afternoon ride to Delwood. The ride to Delwood that afternoon was quiet. Coulter drove. Mara sat beside him with a leather satchel on her lap that contained everything she had gathered over the past 2 months. The written account of the timing patterns, the record of Doyle's confession, the notes she had made after each conversation with Adelaide Marsh, the documented connection between Galt's land bank relationship and the properties of both Corbett and Plunkett, and one additional item she had not yet shown Coulter. She had found it 3 weeks ago, in a conversation with a surveyor named Walt Greer, who had done boundary work in Harlan County for 20 years, and who had mentioned in the course of a completely unrelated discussion about fence line disputes that he had been hired twice in the past 4 years to assess the water rights boundary on the North Creek, once by the county and once by a private party whose name he had not volunteered and she had not pushed for at the time. She had gone back to Greer the week after the fire, and she had pushed. The private party was a land-holding company registered in the territory capital. The company's listed officers were 3 names she had not recognized. The company's registered agent, however, the person who had signed the legal filings, was a Delwood attorney named Gerald Moss, who had an office on the main road 2 doors from the feed merchant, and who also happened to handle Vernon Galt's property transactions. The connection was not proof. It was a thread. But it was a thread that ran from Galt's attorney through a holding company to a secret land survey of the very boundary he had been trying to compromise the Hayes Ranch over, and it was the kind of thread that a careful lawman with subpoena authority could pull a great deal further than she could. She had written it all out in a clear sequential account, 4 pages in her careful handwriting, and it was the last document in the satchel. Cray's office was in the courthouse building on Delwood's north end, a 2-room arrangement that smelled of old paper and lamp oil. He was waiting for them when they arrived, which she took as a sign that he had spent the morning doing his own work and wanted to compare it to theirs. He had. He laid out what he'd gotten from Craddock. Not much, not yet, but the shape of it was beginning to show. Craddock had been careful through the night, saying very little, but by morning the weight of 5 criminal charges and the prospect of a frontier prison had produced a crack in his careful silence, and through that crack had come 2 things: a name for the man who had hired him for the previous night's operation, which was not Galt directly, but a middleman named Sutter, who worked the territory as a hired facilitator of the kind of problems that needed to disappear without obvious fingerprints, and an admission that Sutter had been paid through a third-party account. "Sutter's name I know," Cray said. He was sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the surface in front of him. "He's operated in 4 counties. Never been convicted because the chain between him and whoever hires him is always long enough that the direct connection doesn't hold in court." "Then we go around Sutter," Mara said. Cray looked at her. She opened the satchel and took out the documents. and she laid them on his desk in the order she had assembled them, explaining each one as she set it down. Cray listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to appreciate about him. He was a man who understood that information had sequence, and that disrupting the sequence before it finished producing its conclusion was wasteful. When she got to the last document, the surveyor, the holding company, the attorney, Cray picked it up and read it twice. Moss, he said. Moss is the registered agent. The holding company filed a petition with the Territorial Land Office 14 months ago for a preliminary review of the North Creek boundary. The petition was denied on procedural grounds and refiled 6 months later under a slightly different company name. Same registered agent. Cray set the paper down. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who is holding something that has just made a complicated picture significantly clearer. If Galt gets the North Creek boundary redrawn in his favor, Coulter said. He had been listening from his chair against the wall, letting Mara lead but tracking every step. He controls the primary water source for 3 properties, including ours. Including yours, Cray agreed. And if our ranch fails before the boundary is settled, our water rights claim is uncontested at the estate level, Mara said. The holding company petitions the land office. The land office reviews the boundary without an opposing claim, and Galt ends up with the water rights through a company that nobody can easily connect to him. The room was quiet for a moment. That's a patient plan, Cray said. It took years, Mara said. The sabotage wasn't frustration. It was scheduled. He needed the ranch to fail within a specific window, before the next boundary petition session at the Territorial Land Office, which is in the spring. Cray looked at Coulter. You knew any of this? I knew Galt wanted my land, Coulter said. I didn't know the mechanism until she worked it out. Cray looked at Mara again with the now familiar quality of a man adjusting a previous assessment. He picked up the document about the holding company and set it aside from the others. I'm going to need to take this to the Territorial Marshal's office, he said. This is above county jurisdiction now. The land fraud element crosses into territorial law. It's going to take time. How much time? Coulter said. Weeks. Maybe more. The marshal's office doesn't move fast. He paused. But they move thoroughly. And Moss being involved, an attorney with a land office filing, that's the kind of thing they take seriously because it implicates the integrity of the territorial property system. Mara nodded. She had expected this. The law's thoroughness and the law's speed were inversely related, and she had made her peace with that. What about Galt in the meantime? Coulter said. He doesn't know what we have, Mara said, before Cray could answer. He knows Craddock was taken. He knows the fire failed. He doesn't know about Greer or the holding company. You're sure about that? Greer doesn't move in Galt's circles. The conversation was private, and Moss doesn't know I've connected him to the company yet. I never approached Moss directly. Cray tapped the desk once with his index finger, which seemed to be his version of approval. Keep it that way. Don't approach Moss. Don't let Galt know the scope of what you have. Agreed, she said. Coulter said nothing, which was his version of agreement when he was restraining a strong preference for a more direct approach. They rode home in the late afternoon light with the satchel lighter and the shape of the next few weeks mapped out in Mara's head. It was not the resolution she wanted. She had wanted something that moved faster, something that matched the pace of the previous night's violence, which had been swift and immediate, and had asked for a swift and immediate response. The law's answer to everything was patience, more patience, and she was not a patient person by nature, whatever impression she gave. She managed patience the way she managed most difficult things, by finding the practical tasks within it and staying focused on those. The barn wall repair took the better part of a week, and she worked it alongside the hands, which by this point was unremarkable. Brock had stopped treating her presence in the working parts of the ranch as something to be tolerated and had moved, without ceremony, to treating her as a functional member of the operation. He didn't soften. Brock was constitutionally incapable of softening. But he included her in his morning assessments without being asked, which was the only version of acceptance that mattered to her. Dutch had become, in his compressed and monosyllabic way, something approaching an ally. He consulted her on the winter supply inventory, presenting her with the ledger one evening after supper and saying, "You're better at this than I am," which was Dutch's way of both offering a compliment and declining a responsibility he had always found tedious. She took the ledger and managed it without making anything of it. Eli remained Eli, openly warm, easily impressed, occasionally underfoot, but always useful when it mattered. River brought her a second pair of gloves when the first wore through, and this time he was there when she found them. And he looked at her with his steady, considering gaze and said, "You know the North Trail better than I thought a person could learn it in one season." "I walked it a lot," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw you twice. Didn't think it was my business to mention." She looked at him. "Thank you for saying what you said in the kitchen that night." He shrugged, one shoulder, minimal. "It was the accurate thing. These were the accumulations of a life being built, and she was aware of them with the particular awareness of someone who had not had much to accumulate before and knew better than to take any of it for granted. What she was less prepared for was Coulter, not because he became a different person, he didn't, and she would not have wanted him to. He remained deliberate, economical with words, more comfortable with action than expression, but there was a shift in how he occupied the space around her, something she noticed first as small things. He started waiting for her in the mornings before the ride-out, which he hadn't done before. He asked her opinion on decisions that were technically his alone to make, which fields to rest through the winter, whether to extend a credit arrangement with the feed merchant, how to handle a fence line dispute with the neighbor to the west, who was considerably less threatening than Galt, but still technically in the wrong. He asked, and then he listened, not performing consideration, but actually working through her answers. One evening, he told her something about himself that he had never mentioned, about why the ranch mattered to him the way it mattered, which was connected to a father who had failed at everything he tried and died believing the land was against him, and Coulter, who had decided at 17 that the land was not against anyone, that it was just difficult and required the right kind of attention. He said this in plain, unadorned language, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, not looking for a particular response, just putting it there between them the way you put things on a table when you've decided someone has a right to see them. She told him about her mother, the way her mother had managed everything in that two-room homestead with the systematic, uncomplaining competence of a woman who had accepted that no help was coming and had built her own methods around that acceptance. How Mara had watched her do this from the time she was old enough to watch, and had understood without being told that this was simply what was required. You looked at what was in front of you, you figured out what could be done, and you did it, because the alternative was giving up, and that was not available. She never complained, Mara said, not once that I heard. I used to think that meant she was at peace with it. Later I thought it meant she was exhausted past the point where complaining cost less than silence. Which do you think now? She considered it. Both, she said. People are usually both. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to read as Coulter processing something at a level below the verbal. You're not like her, he said. In some ways. You complain less than anyone I've ever met, he said, but you're not exhausted into it.
Your chat, he
stopped, searching for the word with the effortful honesty of a man who doesn't produce language casually. Deliberate, he said finally. You chose this. Every day, she said. He reached across the table and touched her hand, and this time he didn't pull back quickly the way he had at the well. He left his hand there, and she turned her palm up, and they sat like that for a while, which was the frontier version of a declaration, and both of them knew it. The territorial marshal's investigator arrived in Delwood on a gray Wednesday morning 3 weeks after Cray had sent his report north. His name was Dace Holbrook, and he was not the kind of man who announced himself dramatically. He checked into the Delwood Hotel, had a meal, and spent his first day reading documents in Cray's office before he spoke to anyone else. Mara found this approach reassuring. She met with him on the second day at Cray's office and laid out everything she had in the same sequential way she had presented it to Cray. Holbrook listened with a legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand that he used rarely, which told her he was the kind of person who processed verbally and noted only what required noting. When she finished, he said, "The holding company. Did you get the filing numbers from the Territorial Land Office directly?" "I got them from the surveyor who saw the original petition document. He had a copy of the filing reference." "And Greer is willing to testify to that?" "He said he would. He's not comfortable about it. Moss has done legal work in the county for a long time, and Greer has to live here. But he said he would. Holbrook nodded. The attorney connection is the key. If we can establish Moss as the direct link between Galt and the holding company, the land fraud case builds from there. The sabotage and the arson attempt become evidence of Galt's willingness to use criminal means to advance the fraud. He paused. It's a solid picture. It took work to build. It took time, she said. Same thing. Often. Coulter was outside the courthouse when she came out, sitting on the front step in the cold morning air with his elbows on his knees in the unself-conscious way of a man waiting who doesn't feel the need to perform patience. He looked up when the door opened. Well, he said. He's going to move on Moss first, she said. Subpoena the company records. If the records show what I think they show, Galt gets a formal investigation, not just a county inquiry. Coulter was quiet for a moment. How long? Holbrook said 2 weeks for the initial findings. He nodded. Then he said, You did that yourself, built the whole case from a conversation about fence lines. And a lot of walking around looking at things. Mara. She looked at him. He stood up from the step, which put him at his full height in front of her, and he said, I want to say something clearly, and I'm not good at this, so I'm going to say it plainly, and you're going to have to take it as it is. All right, she said. I chose you because I thought you were capable of something. I was right, but I didn't know I was right. I was guessing based on something I saw in 20 minutes at a wagon. I got lucky. He held her gaze. What you've done for this ranch, and for me, is more than I had any right to expect from anyone. And I'm aware that I haven't said that. I should have. She stood on the courthouse step in the gray morning and looked at this man who had pulled her out of an invisible corner and handed her a real life, and who was now standing in front of her saying, in his careful, economical way, that he knew what she had given and that it mattered to him. You gave me something too, she said. You should know that. A ranch with problems. A place to stand, she said, and people to stand with. That's not nothing. For someone who didn't have it, that's considerable. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was not elegant or practiced, but was genuine, and she leaned into it briefly before they both straightened up and stepped off the courthouse step because they had horses to get back to, and it was getting cold standing still. The 2 weeks Holbrook had estimated became 3, and the 3 became 4, and in the 4th week a Tuesday morning brought the news that Gerald Moss had been served with a territorial subpoena for the financial records of the holding company, and that he had responded to this news by doing something that criminals with good instincts sometimes do when they understand the size of what is closing in. He had gone to Cray's office and asked to speak to the marshal's investigator. He had decided, in other words, that being the second person to talk was better than being the last. What Moss gave Holbrook was complete. It was the kind of complete that happens when a man who has spent his professional life managing other people's exposure to legal risk suddenly finds himself entirely exposed and discovers that the instinct for self-preservation overrides every other loyalty. He gave Holbrook the records, the correspondence, the payment trail, and 3 years of documented instructions from Vernon Galt that amounted to a detailed map of fraud, conspiracy, and, in the context of the arson attempt, conspiracy to commit violence against persons. Cray came to the Hayes Ranch on a Thursday morning to tell them personally, which Mara had not expected and which she understood as his way of marking the significance of the moment without making a speech about it. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and said, Galt was arrested this morning at his property. Corbett was brought in an hour ago. Plunkett turned himself in before we got to him, which will probably help him at sentencing. He paused. Sutter, the facilitator, was picked up in the next county yesterday. He's been charged in connection with 4 separate cases across the territory, and he's not getting out. Coulter stood very still, the way he stood still when he was containing something large. Mara said, What are the charges against Galt? Land fraud, conspiracy to defraud, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit arson with intent to harm. Cray looked at her steadily. The last one carries significant weight. She nodded. The water rights petition is void, Cray continued. Holbrook filed with the Territorial Land Office yesterday. The Hayes Ranch North Creek boundary stands as it was. Another silence. A longer one. Coulter said, I want to thank you, Cray, for doing it right. Cray put his hat back on. "That's the job," he said, in the tone of a man who means it simply and doesn't need it elaborated. He shook Coulter's hand and then he looked at Mara. He extended his hand to her too. She shook it. "The case file is going to list the original evidence as coming from the property owner," Cray said. "I want you to know that the investigator's report specifies clearly that the initial investigation was conducted by you. That's on the official record." He nodded once, and then he walked back to his horse and rode toward Delwood. Mara stood in the yard in the morning light and felt something that she would have had difficulty naming precisely. It was not triumph, which she had always imagined would feel larger and louder than this. It was quieter. It was the feeling of a thing that had cost real effort being completed, and of the ground beneath her feet being, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely solid. Eli let out a sound from behind her that was most accurately described as a whoop, which broke the silence and made Dutch turn from where he was standing with an expression of controlled disapproval that fooled no one. River was leaning against the barn doorframe and watching, and when Mara turned he gave her the smallest nod, the kind that carries more than its size suggests. Brock walked past her toward the barn and said, without stopping or looking at her, "Good work," in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting a practical observation. Coming from Brock, it was a considerable thing. Coulter came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Charlotte Aldridge is going to hear about this by sundown," he said, finally. "I know. The whole county will know by the end of the week. I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "Does that feel like anything?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Less than I thought it would," she said. "I spent a long time thinking about what it would feel like when people who decided I was nothing found out they were wrong. I thought I'd feel—" She paused. "I don't know. Larger. And instead? Instead, I mostly want breakfast," she said. Coulter Hayes laughed. It was not a performative laugh or a polished one. It was the real thing, sudden and a little rough, the laugh of a man who doesn't do it often enough that it comes out smoothly. It surprised them both. She smiled, which was also the real thing, and they went inside because it was cold and there was work to get back to, and the ranch that someone had tried very hard to take from them was still standing and would keep standing because they were both still in it. Winter came to Harlan County the way it always did, without asking permission and without easing anyone into it gradually. One week the mornings were cold and manageable, and then a front came down from the north and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night, and the ground went hard and the water troughs needed breaking every morning, and the days shortened to the point where the light felt borrowed. The Hayes Ranch moved through it. That was the honest description of the winter that followed Galt's arrest. Not triumph, not celebration, but work. The continuous and unglamorous work of keeping a livestock operation alive through a hard season. The barn's south wall had been repaired before the first freeze, which Mara counted as one of the better pieces of timing in recent memory. The winter supply inventory she had reorganized in the fall held without the shortfalls that had plagued the previous 2 seasons. The cattle rotation through the upper pasture, adjusted based on what she had observed of the grass distribution during her months of walking the property, preserved the lower pasture's carrying capacity better than the previous year. None of this was dramatic. All of it mattered. What also mattered, in a different way, was what was happening in Delwood and in the territory beyond it, largely out of the ranch's direct view, but present in the news that came with supply runs and in the conversations Mara had when she made her regular trips to town. The territorial case against Vernon Galt moved with the deliberate, grinding pace of formal legal proceedings, which was frustrating if you were impatient and reassuring if you understood that speed and thoroughness were generally in tension. By the time the first hard frost came, the fraud charges had been formally filed. By midwinter, the conspiracy charges had been added. Corbett had retained a lawyer who was trying to separate his client's culpability from Galt's, with limited success, because Moss's records documented the relationship between them in the specific, detailed way that financial records do when they have been carefully kept and then produced under subpoena. Plunkett, who had turned himself in and cooperated, received a different treatment from the territorial court. A significant fine, a suspended sentence, and a formal prohibition from holding any land title in the territory for 10 years. He came to the Hayes Ranch on a January afternoon, arriving on horseback alone, and asked to speak to Mara specifically. Coulter was in the yard when Plunkett rode up and looked at him with the flat, measuring attention he gave to problems that hadn't resolved themselves yet. "I'll hear what he has to say," Mara said from behind him. Coulter moved aside, not happily, but he moved. Plunkett was a man in his mid-50s who had the look of someone who had spent the past several months sleeping badly. He took his hat off when he dismounted, which was not lost on either of them. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. He didn't try to build up to anything. "I came to tell you directly that I knew what Galt was doing. Not all of it. I didn't know about the men he sent that night. I want to be clear about that. But I knew about the sabotage, and I didn't stop it, and I didn't report it. I told myself it was between Galt and Hayes, and it wasn't my business." He paused. "It was my business. I was wrong to make it someone else's." Mara looked at him steadily.
Why are you here?
"Because an apology delivered to a judge doesn't count the same as one delivered to the people you wronged," he said. "My wife told me that, and she was right." There was a silence. Coulter said nothing, which meant he was letting her handle it. "I accept that you're saying this," she said carefully. "I'm not going to tell you it's settled between us because I don't know yet if it is. What I'll tell you is that I heard you." Plunkett nodded. It was not the full absolution he might have hoped for, but it was honest, and he seemed to recognize it as such. He put his hat back on. "Your ranch is going to be the strongest in the county," he said. "Probably already is." He mounted his horse. "I hope things go well for you both." He rode out. Coulter watched him go and then turned to Mara. "You didn't have to hear him." "No," she said, "but there was no good reason not to." She looked at where Plunkett had disappeared around the tree line. "He's going to have to live in this county with what he did. I don't need to make that harder than it already is. He didn't earn that consideration. I know. That's why it's mine to give or not give. It's not about what he earned." She turned back toward the house. "I'm not doing it for him." Coulter looked at her for a moment with an expression that she had learned over these months to read as a man encountering something that slightly exceeds his expectation and is trying to absorb it without making too much of a display. He followed her inside without saying anything else, which was its own kind of response. The letter from Charlotte Aldridge arrived in February, which surprised Mara enough that she read it twice before she trusted her initial reading of it. It was not a long letter. Charlotte was not, as it turned out, a woman who could produce false warmth convincingly on paper, and she didn't try to. What she wrote was something closer to a correction, a formal, careful acknowledgement that the picture she had painted of Mara in the months following the selection had been unfair and had been deliberately constructed, and that the record of what Mara had actually done for the Hayes Ranch and for the broader community spoke for itself in a way that Charlotte had no interest in continuing to argue against. She did not say she was sorry in those words. She said she was writing to set the record straight, which in Charlotte Aldridge's vocabulary was probably the same thing. Mara read it a third time and then set it on the kitchen table. "She wrote to you?" Coulter said, seeing the letter. "She wrote to correct herself," Mara said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "It means she cares about accuracy more than she cares about being right," Mara said. "That's actually a reasonable quality. I respect it even if I don't particularly like her." Coulter read the letter. He set it down. "You're going to respond." "I am." "What are you going to say?" "That I received her letter and I appreciate her directness." She paused. "And that if she ever needs anything practical, she knows where we are." He raised an eyebrow at that. "She's alone in this county," Mara said. "Her social position here was built on a situation that's now resolved in a way that leaves her without the structure she built. That's not a good place to be." She said this without particular sympathy, but also without pleasure. "I'm not going to chase a friendship with her, but I'm not going to close a door on someone who's standing on the wrong side of one." Coulter looked at her for a long moment. "You think that way about everybody." "I try to. It must be exhausting." "Sometimes," she admitted, "but the alternative is simpler and less accurate, and I don't do well with inaccuracy." He smiled at that. Not the sudden rough laugh from the yard after Cray left, but a quieter version, the kind that lives in the eyes more than the mouth. It was becoming less rare, that smile. She noticed. Spring came, and with it the territorial court's formal sentencing in the Galt case. Mara attended, which she had decided to do from the beginning, not for the satisfaction of watching, but because she had built the case and she intended to see it close properly with her own eyes. The courtroom in the territory capital was larger than Delwood's courthouse and considerably less personal, which was appropriate. Galt sat at the defense table in a suit that fit him well and looked at the front of the room with the contained expression of a man who has spent months preparing himself for an outcome and has arrived at a state beyond denial. He was 61 years old, and in the months since his arrest, he appeared to have gotten older faster than those months warranted. He looked at Mara once, when she came in and took a seat in the gallery. It was a look she held without looking away, because she had nothing to hide and she had not come here to be looked away from. He turned back to the front after a moment and didn't look at her again. The judge read the findings with professional economy. Land fraud in the first degree, conspiracy to commit property destruction, conspiracy to commit arson with intent to harm persons. The sentences ran consecutively, which the judge explained with the careful, specific language of territorial law, and which amounted to a period of confinement that Galt, at 61, would not come out of with any of the life he had tried to preserve by destroying someone else's. Corbett received a shorter sentence, with the reduced term reflecting his lesser role and his eventual cooperation. Moss, the attorney, was disbarred and received a substantial prison term, with the judge noting specifically that the involvement of a licensed legal professional in the systematic deception of the Territorial Land Office represented a particular breach of the public trust. Mara sat through all of it without exultation, which she had somewhat expected of herself and had been prepared for. What she felt was more like the specific, contained satisfaction of a problem solved. Not joyful, but complete. The way you feel when something broken has been fixed and you can put the tools down. She rode back to Harlan County on the afternoon coach, and when she got home, the ranch was doing what it always did at the beginning of spring, producing more immediate demands than there were hours in the day, which was the frontier's version of normal. The first rancher to come asking for her advice arrived in April. His name was Gordon Marsh, no relation to Adelaide, and he ran a medium-sized cattle operation 2 valleys east that had been struggling with a persistent water management problem for 3 seasons. He came to the front gate on a Tuesday morning and asked, with the somewhat uncomfortable directness of a man who has talked himself into doing something he would previously have refused to do, whether Mrs. Hayes had time to come look at his east pasture situation. Coulter happened to be in the yard when Marsh arrived, and he directed him to the house with a neutral expression that became, when he told Mara, something she read as quietly pleased. She went to Marsh's property the following Thursday. She walked the east pasture carefully and asked the same kind of systematic questions she always asked, about the seasonal patterns, the soil behavior, where the water moved and where it collected and what happened to the grass in the areas that flooded. She spent 2 hours on it and told him what she thought was causing the problem and what she would do about it if it were her land. "It's not complicated," she said. "It's just specific." "My foreman's been working this land 12 years, Marsh said. He was not defensive. He was genuinely puzzled. "How did you see it in 2 hours?" "I didn't come in assuming I already knew what was wrong," she said. "That helps." He tried what she suggested. By midsummer, it was working. After that, the requests came in 1s and 2s with the irregular rhythm of people who had genuine problems and had slowly revised their opinion of where help might be available. Pearl Briggs sent 2 of her neighbors. A homesteader named Callum Cross, again, no relation to the woman from the selection day, came about a cattle disease that was moving through his herd with symptoms his usual remedies weren't touching. Mara had seen something similar in Millhaven once, had watched a neighboring farmer handle it, and she told Callum what the Millhaven farmer had done and why she thought it might apply, and was clear that she wasn't certain. "Try it carefully," she said. "Start with 2 animals, not the whole herd. If it works in 5 days, expand it." It worked in 4 days. She did not charge for any of it, which Coulter pointed out was commercially irrational, and which she acknowledged was commercially irrational and continued to do anyway. Her reasoning, when pressed, was that the relationships were worth more than the fees, and that the relationships were genuine only if they weren't transactional, and that the day she started charging for advice was the day the advice became a product, and the people who came to her became customers instead of neighbors, And she didn't want neighbors who were also customers because it changed everything about how honest you could afford to be with each other. Coulter thought about this for a while and said, "That's a sound argument." "It's also just what I want to do," she said. "That too," he agreed. What grew from this was not the social transformation that a story told from the outside might describe, the whole county reversing its opinion simultaneously, the woman who had been dismissed becoming the woman everyone celebrated, the arc of triumph clean and satisfying. That is not how real things work, and Mara would have been suspicious of any version of her life that looked like that. What grew was more gradual and more durable. A network of practical relationships with people who had found her useful and reliable and honest, and who therefore trusted her in the specific, limited way that frontier people trust, not with sentiment, but with problems, which is the more valuable form. A reputation that was built entirely on evidence and therefore couldn't be dismantled by rumor. A place in the county that she had not been assigned but had made herself through accumulated mornings and afternoons of paying attention to things other people had stopped looking at. Dutch retired from active ranch foreman duties in the summer, citing a knee that had been quietly deteriorating for 2 years and that he had mentioned to no one until it was impossible to ignore. He did not leave the ranch, chose. He moved into the smaller of the 2 spare rooms in the main house, which Coulter offered without making it a larger gesture than it needed to be, and Dutch accepted without making it a larger gesture than it needed to be, and that was the end of that negotiation. He became, in practice, a permanent presence who did what he could do and consulted on what he could no longer do physically, which was considerable. Eli Pryor left in the autumn to start his own operation on a small claim he'd been saving for since he was 17, which he did with the particular combination of excitement and terror that is specific to young people stepping off the edge of what they know into what they want. He came to say goodbye on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands and told Mara, with the direct emotional honesty of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by it, that working on the Hayes Ranch was the best education he'd gotten in his life. She shook his hand and told him he was going to do well, and she meant it, and he knew she meant it, which was the most useful thing she could have given him to take with him. Rivers stayed. He never said he was staying. He simply continued to be there, doing his work with the same quality of focused, quiet competence he had always brought to it. And one morning Mara came into the barn to find he had already handled a difficult situation with a laboring cow that would have taken her twice as long to manage alone, and she thanked him, and he nodded, and that was the nature of it. Brock stayed too, and continued to say exactly as much as he thought needed saying, which was rarely more than a sentence at a time, and to do his work with the undemonstrative professionalism that was the closest thing to integrity she had ever seen enacted in daily practice. The ranch grew. Not explosively. Nothing about the Hayes operation had ever been explosive, and neither Coulter nor Mara had any interest in growth that outpaced their ability to manage it properly. But steadily, in the way that things grow when they are correctly tended, the operation expanded its grazing territory through a careful land purchase the following year, improved its water infrastructure using the techniques Mara had been developing since her first week on the property, and built a reputation with the territory's cattle buyers for producing consistent, well-managed stock that arrived at market in reliable condition. Coulter and Mara moved into the same room in the late spring of their first full year together, which happened without ceremony or announcement, and was noticed by no one on the ranch except Dutch, who made no comment but whose expression at breakfast the following morning contained in Mara's reading of it the compressed satisfaction of a man whose opinion of the situation had always been more favorable than he had let on. They were not, by the end of that first year, the couple the territory had predicted, the mismatched pair limping along on impractical choices. They were also not a story of perfect love and seamless partnership, because neither of them was built for seamless. They were 2 people who argued sometimes about real things, in the direct and occasionally heated way of people who take their work and each other seriously enough to disagree without pretending. They were 2 people who had each, in the other, found someone who was honest with them, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than almost anything else. What had changed for Mara was something she would have been hard-pressed to articulate cleanly, because the most important changes rarely articulate cleanly. She had arrived in Delwood with nothing she wanted to keep from Millhaven except the habits her mother had given her, the systematic attention, the patience with difficult problems, the refusal to pretend something was better than it was. She had arrived expecting, at best, a workable situation, a place to be useful, a life built on function rather than meaning. She had gotten more than that. Not because it had been given to her, nothing had been given to her, or not without cost, but because she had built it, day by day, with the tools she had brought and the ones she had made from what she found here. She thought about this on a September evening when she walked the north pasture alone as she still did, still finding the early morning or late evening walks the best time to think clearly. The light was going amber and long across the grass, and the granite of the Harlan breaks caught it on its western faces and held it for a moment before letting go, and she stood at the edge of the upper pasture and looked at the whole of what she had spent a year learning to understand. This was hers. Not only in the legal sense, though the legal sense mattered, in the sense that she knew it, knew its difficult places and its generous ones, knew where the water moved and where the grass held and where the wind came from in different seasons. She had put her attention into this land until it had begun to give back the kind of knowledge that land only gives to people who take it seriously. She was 30 years old. She had been, at 23, the woman nobody wanted. Too plain, too poor, too plain-spoken, too much of the wrong things, and not enough of the right ones by the measures people in small places apply to women when they are deciding what they are worth. She had known that was what she was. She had not argued with it, because arguing with the way people see you is a losing project, and her energy was limited, and she had preferred to spend it on things that changed. What she had understood, in the year that had passed, was something that the people who had dismissed her had not been wrong about. Exactly. They were simply wrong about what it meant. She was plain. She was not polished. She was not the kind of woman whose entrance into a room shifted the temperature or whose smile could move a man to bad decisions. These things were true. They had just turned out not to be the things that mattered for the life she was actually living. What mattered was whether you paid attention, whether you showed up for difficult things, whether you told the truth when it was costly and kept your word when it was inconvenient, whether you looked at a problem without deciding in advance what you were going to find, whether you could stand in the dark on a road in the middle of the night with a gun in your hands and be frightened and do it anyway. Not everyone could do those things. Some people who were beautiful couldn't do them. Some people who were educated couldn't do them. Some people who had every apparent advantage and every social recommendation couldn't do them, and found out only under pressure that what they had been given was not the same as what they had built. She had built what she had. It had cost her, and it was real, and nobody could take it back by changing their opinion of her. Coulter came up the pasture trail at some point while she was thinking, and she heard him coming by the sound of his boots on the dry grass because he made no effort to be quiet. He never did, on his own land. He came to stand beside her and looked at the same view she was looking at, which he had probably looked at 1,000 times, but which she had still not exhausted. "Dutch is threatening to cook supper if you're not back in 20 minutes, he said. "Dutch's cooking will kill us before anything else does." "That's what I told him." He looked at her sideways. "You all right?" "Yes." She meant it simply. "I was just thinking." "About?" She considered how to answer. Coulter deserved accurate answers, and accurate answers to complex questions required a certain amount of compression to be honest rather than merely complete. "About how different this is from what I thought I was coming to," she said, "and how it turned out to be better in ways I didn't know to ask for." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the broken light on the brakes. "Same," he said. It was one word and it was enough, and they both knew it. He put his arm around her shoulders in the easy, unself-conscious way he had developed over the year. Not a man who had learned to be comfortable with tenderness, exactly, but a man who had decided it was worth the unfamiliarity, which was its own kind of courage. She leaned into it. The light on the granite was going quickly now, dropping from amber to a thin pale gold, and the air was cooling fast with the September evening. There is a thing that happens to people who choose correctly. And by correctly, I don't mean safely or conventionally, or in the way that makes sense from the outside. I mean the way that is true to what they actually are, and what actually matters, even when it costs them something, even when it looks wrong from every available angle. What happens is that the choice becomes, over time, not just right, but necessary. The kind of thing you can't imagine having not done, because the version of you that didn't do it is so much smaller that it barely registers as a real possibility. Coulter Hayes had made a choice that everyone in Harlan County told him was wrong, and he had made it for reasons he could not have fully articulated at the time, something he had seen in 20 minutes at the end of a wagon, in a woman dealing with a broken trunk strap, without asking for help. He had not been certain. He had been, as he said that day in front of the courthouse, guessing. He had guessed right, and more importantly, he had created the conditions in which the guess could become something real. He had given it space and respect and the practical trust that allows capable people to actually be capable instead of performing a narrower version of themselves for someone else's comfort. Mara Quinn had made a choice too, and hers was less romantic in its framing and more honest for it. She had come to Delwood because she needed somewhere to go, and she had stayed because what she found was worth staying for, and she had built a life here in the only way she knew how to build anything, which was carefully and from the ground up, and with full attention to what was actually there. Between them, they had made a ranch into something more than the sum of its land and livestock. They had made it into a place where the people who worked there were treated as people, where difficult problems were taken seriously rather than avoided, where the standard for good enough was always slightly higher than comfortable, and where two individuals who were each, in their different ways, difficult to know, had found in each other exactly the kind of company that doesn't require you to be less than what you are. The territory remembered the story of Coulter Hayes and the bride nobody wanted for a long time. And over the years, the story changed, the way stories do. Some versions made it more dramatic, some made Mara more beautiful, some added characters and conflicts that were not in the original. The version that lasted longest was the simplest one, and it went like this. A man who was looking for something real found it in the last place anyone expected, and the woman who had been told she was nothing turned out to be the thing that made everything work. That version was true, as far as it went. What it left out was the winter mornings and the hard seasons, the arguments and the exhaustion, and the moments of doubt that come for everyone who has bet their life on a choice that wasn't guaranteed. What it left out was Dutch threatening to cook supper, and River's silent, reliable presence, and the particular quality of Brock's single-sentence praise. What it left out was the fear on a dark road with a gun and the patience required to build a legal case from conversations at a dry goods store and the specific satisfaction of a water trough that stopped leaking. Real lives are made of those things more than of the story that gets told about them afterward. But the story that gets told matters too, because it is what travels beyond the county line and what outlasts the people in it. And if the story of Mara Quinn traveled far enough and lasted long enough to reach someone who needed to hear it, someone who had been told they were not enough, who had been placed at the end of a wagon by people who had already decided they didn't count, then the story was doing its actual work. The frontier was not kind to women who didn't fit the expected shape. It was not kind to people who came to it without money or connections or the right kind of appearance. It took from those people first and gave back to them last, and frequently, not at all. But occasionally, in the gap between what was expected and what turned out to be true, something real got built. On a September evening on the north pasture of the Hayes Ranch, with the Harlan breaks going dark behind them and Dutch's cooking waiting at the house, and the whole weight of a hard year settled into something that felt, for the first time, like ground they had actually earned, Mara Hayes looked at what she had made and found it sufficient. More than sufficient. She turned back down the trail toward the lights of the house, and Coulter walked beside her, and the night came on behind them, and the ranch held.